On a bitter winter morning in what is now Norfolk, a strange procession wound through the frost-covered fields. No banners, no chants, just the muffled sobs of a young girl and the silent terror of bound men. At the head of the line was a wooden cart filled with earth. Inside it, the queen's body was wrapped in linen and salt. But she was not alone. Her most loyal handmaidens were tied to stakes alive's wild mouths, gagged. The pit had already been dug, and they were going in. With her, not for treason, not for crime, but because she demanded it. What happened next would stain the soil of ancient Britain for over 1,000 years. Before Britain was Britain, it was forest, not the soft, storybook kind, but dense, tangled wilds that swallowed light and memory. The trees were older than names, the sky often hidden. And in those dark ages, before Rome's iron roads cleaved the island into order, the land was ruled not by kings, but by gods of blood, ash, and bone. It was in this world that Cartimandua was born, daughter to a chief of the Brigantes, one of the largest and most feared tribes in what is now northern England. Cartimandua came into a world defined by ritual, omens, and debt paid in. Fleshed from the beginning, she was different. While her brothers played at sword games and broke bones in initiation rites, Cartimandua sat by the cairnfires, listening to the priestesses whisper. She watched them burn bone to read smoke, smear blood in sigils, and speak to gods buried in tree roots. Her first memory, it's claimed, was the scream of a calf being gutted for sacrifice. Her second was the silence that followed. She did not flinch. As a child, she was taught that loyalty was stronger than love, that those who serve the queen must serve her soul in this life and the next. The stories were everywhere. Handmaidens strangled and buried beneath cairns. Warriors who opened their throats beside their fallen lords. Wives sealed into their husbands' arms with honey and ash. These weren't tragedies. They were honored. Cartimandua didn't question it. She memorized the rites, watched the burnings, and held the hands of girls too young to understand what obedience meant. When her mother died, the head handmaiden was buried with her alive. No one cried. No one screamed. Not even the handmaiden. She simply drank a potion, smiled, and lay down in the hollow earth. Cartimandua, only 10, helped pour the dirt. And when she grew older, taller, paler, her eyes like wet iron, people began to say she was not just born to rule, but touched. It's a mouthpiece of the gods. A vessel that could not rot, but she was not divine. She was watching, remembering, calculating. And when the Romans came, Cartimandua would not run. She would make a pact with the invaders. And with death itself, when the legions came, they did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like a slow knife metal glinting through mist, boots pressing down sacred soil 1 inch at a time. It was the year 51 AD. The Roman conquest of Britain was no longer a campaign, it was a swallowing. Forts rose like teeth across the countryside. Sacred groves were chopped down for timber. Rivers were renamed. Gods were mocked. Temples desecrated. And the tribes of Britain, they were broken or burning. But Cartimandua bent, while others fought, like the defiant warrior Queen Boudica, who would later be flayed by history and fire. Cartimandua opened her gates. She welcomed Rome, and Rome, in turn, crowned her queen. But this was not peace. This was chess. She offered them roads. They gave her iron. She gave them grain. They gave her soldiers. She handed them the rebel king Caratacus, bound and humiliated, delivered not for conquest, but for strategy. Her people, however, saw it for what it was. Betrayal. Whispers spread like rot through the hills. The Brigantes called her a whore queen, a wolf draped in Roman silk. But they dared not act, not openly. It's because, with Roman backing, Cartimandua's power was absolute, and she wielded it without mercy. She created a secret tribunal, the Red Circle, named for the ochre-dyed stones placed at the graves of the condemned. Accusations were swift. Trials did not exist. Suspects, druids, disloyal lords, even family, vanished. Rumors said they were buried beneath the queen's longhouse. Others claimed they were sacrificed in the old rites, stripped, naked, slit open, and thrown into peat bogs to rot with ancient gods. But even this blood was not enough. as Roman customs seeped into her court. Cartimandua grew obsessed with loyalty beyond death. She revived a forgotten rite, soul-binding, a vow where handmaidens swore to follow their queen into the afterlife, literally, not through memory. Through burial. At first, it was symbolic, a whispered oath, but then one girl disappeared. Her name was Brenna, 15, kind, loyal. One night, she told another servant, "If the queen dies before me, I will go with her willingly." The next morning, she was gone. Cartimandua told the court Brenna had ascended. The pit diggers told another story. They said Brenna's scream never stopped, that it echoed through the earth for 3 days. Trapped beneath the burial mound like a moth inside a dying flame. But the queen was unmoved. She spoke of legacy, of divine continuity, of the ancient laws that govern blood and soil. "What dies with me," she declared to her court, "must be mine, bone to bone, breath to breath." And so the Pact of the Pit was born. It was written not in ink, but in cuts ritual carvings on the arms of chosen girls and boys, marked with wolf-fang sigils and bound to the queen's burial vow. These weren't criminals. They were her closest attendants, those she claimed were blessed to walk with her into death. Some believed it, others pretended. But the queen kept a ledger and a stone tablet, hidden behind her throne, listing each name she would take with her to the earth. 10 women, 3 men, 1 child. They were alive when chosen. That was the point. She said the gods required sacrifice, not of meat, but of memory. The living had to witness. The dead had to feel. One boy tried to escape. His name was Alban, a stable, and, barely 16, when they caught him hiding in a grain store, he was not whipped. He was brought to the great hall during the evening meal, his eyes wide, limbs trembling, and buried alive in front of the feast. Soil poured over his face as nobles ate. None spoke. The queen drank from a chalice of fermented mare's milk and smiled, saying, "We dine as one. We return as one." The pact became sacred law. Servants wore their burial marks like jewelry. Mothers whispered to daughters, "If the queen calls your name, do not weep. 'Tis the greatest honor." But behind the smiles, terror rotted the court, like damp in the bones of a longhouse. And when Cartimandua's health began to fail, spurs returned. Because she would not go alone, and they knew. The pit was already being dug. She began coughing blood in the spring, not a gentle illness, but a violence that shook the longhouse walls deep, battling spasms that left crimson flecks on her bed, furs and iron taste on her tongue. The court physicians called it a chill of the lungs. The druids called it a reckoning. Cartimandua said nothing. Casa's servants noticed the signs. The queen no longer stood for ceremonies. She spoke less. Her meals, once ritualistic, were left untouched. And when she did rise, her footsteps dragged like a woman already halfway into the soil. That's when the orders came. The burial chamber, already designed, already whispered about, was to be expanded. Double the space, reinforce the timbers. A new altar stone was hauled up from the river and carved with spirals of death and rebirth. And most importantly, the chosen names were summoned one by one. 6 women, 2 men, all in their 20s, save for one girl, Kira, only 13. A handmaiden since childhood, Atisi had once braided the queen's hair with violets. Now she wept behind closed doors. Silent as the grave she knew awaited her. The pit was dug on the hill above the cairnstones, overlooking the forest where Cartimandua claimed she had once seen the goddess of death walk barefoot in frost. It was 12 feet deep, lined with wolf pelts, and wide enough for 10 bodhisattva to be buried alive, one to be sealed dead, and one still undecided, because the queen, even on her deathbed, was uncertain about the final soul she would take with her, and so the court waited. Not for the funeral, but for the verdict. One night, a voice as thin as breath through a reed, she whispered, "Greater than I must not go alone. Let them carry me with their hearts beating." Her breath stank of blood and mold. Her eyes were almost blind. But the servants obeyed. The chosen were stripped of their names. They were dressed in white, bound, fed a final meal of bitter roots and honey. They were not told when the burial would come, because that, too, was part of the ritual to die in. Tara was to die loyal. They were led to the pit at dawn, not under fanfare, not in procession, but in silence. 8 figures, dressed in linen and trembling, each bound at the wrists with braided flax. Behind them, 4 guards with blades drawn. And behind the guards, the queen herself, barely conscious, carried on a wooden platform, her breath a faint. Wheeze lost in the wind. The hill was wet with morning frost. Crows circled overhead. At the edge of the grave, the chosen knelt, some murmuring prayers, others silent with despair. The pit smelled of pine tar and rotting herbs. It had been sanctified with old blood the night before. One of the priestesses walked the circle 3 times, tossing salt into the grave like it might purify. It was about to happen. And then the descent began. The queen was lowered, first trapped in wool, her eyes closed, her hands stiff against her chest. But she was not dead yet. Witnesses say she was still breathing. Still aware? Then came the servants. They were lowered in pairs, tied 2 stone posts set deep in the grave. Some screamed, some begged. Kira, the youngest, threw herself against the dirt walls, breaking her fingernails as she tried to climb. She cried for her mother. She cried for the gods. She was pushed back down as the final servant was placed inside. The drummers began slow. Rhythmic beats meant to mimic the pulse of the earth. With each strike, a shovelful of dirt was thrown. One woman, Aliyah, tried to bargain. She said she'd renounce her name, her family, her gods. She would exile herself to the northern isles. But no one listened. Cartimandua had decreed they must carry her soul down when the soil reached their knees. The screaming began in earnest. When it reached their waists, they began to choke. One man tried to bite through the bindings on his wrists. Another began to sing an old Brigante lullaby, weeping. Between verses, Kira had gone silent by the time the dirt reached their chests. Only one was still struggling. By the time it reached their mouths, all were still alive. And then, nothing. The pit was sealed, marked only by a flat stone carved with a single word: greater than loyal. The queen's breath stopped some time before the last cries ended, or perhaps because of them. No witnesses spoke again. Those who dug the grave were either paid off or found later with their tongues cut out. What Cartimandua wanted she received. She was not alone. The hill where she was buried became cursed ground. Shepherds avoided it. Children were warned never to climb its slope. Crops near it withered. Livestock refused to graze. Locals whispered of voices beneath the earth-muffled gasps, cries that bled through soil on cold nights. They called it the Queen's Hunger, a place where the living had been tricked into dying for centuries. The story of Queen Cartimandua's grave passed as folklore too grotesque for the historians, too specific to be dismissed. The Roman records barely mention her death at all. Just a vague line: the northern client queen passed, her court dispersed, interment unknown. No tomb, no fanfare. No mention of the 8 who died with her until the excavation in 1912. During a land survey for a planned railway line near modern-day Skipton, workers uncovered a large stone slab embedded in a low hill. It bore no name, just a faded spiral, and traces of reddish pigment. Beneath it, they found what appeared to be a communal grave. What they actually found was a chamber. 10 sets of remains, 9 of them crammed along the edges, partially upright arms bound behind their backs. Soil found inside the rib cages suggested they were alive when the dirt came. One skull had its jaw dislocated mid-scream. Another had fingernail grooves etched into the surrounding stone. And in the center lay a single skeleton, wrapped in decomposed wool and fur, hands folded in ceremonial pose, Cartimandua. At her feet, a broken chalice. Inner chest cavity, a thin, curved blade suggesting her heart had been removed or preserved. No museum claimed the bodies. No plaque marks the hill. Local authorities ordered the site sealed for preservation. But some said it was to silence what had been found. Others say the site has been quietly protected by Britain's historical trust, not to honor it, but to contain it, because something about that place remained wrong. Decades later, a researcher who visited the site during a restricted dig described hearing whispers while inside the burial chamber. When he returned to his hotel, he found red clay beneath his fingernails despite wearing gloves. He died in his sleep that night. His final journal entry read, "The Queen was never alone. They're still there, still waiting." History forgot her, while textbooks praised Boudica for her courage and martyrdom. Cartimandua was quietly erased, written off as a client queen, a political footnote. Her name faded, her deeds unrecorded, her grave unspoken. But legends are harder to bury than bodies. In the folklore of Yorkshire and Cumbria, she remains a shadow figure called the Bone Queen, she of the soil, or simply Carti, farmers speak, of her tomb as a cursed knot in the land. Wiccans hold vigils there. Children dare one another to lie on the stone at night and listen for the breathing, and some hear it. Modern historians debate her existence. Some argue the burial was ritual suicide, not murder. Others claim the queen was already dead before her servants were entombed. Still more insist the story was fabricated by Roman chroniclers to smear a powerful woman who dared to rule by her own terms. But the bones will tell a different story. Anthropologists reviewing the 1912 remains found lividity patterns consistent with live interment. Soil in the lungs, stress fractures on wrists and ankles, young girl's skull cracked from within, possibly by pressure or panic. Every indicator points to a single conclusion. They were buried alive. So why was this never taught? Cartimandua? Not in our history books. Because her story doesn't serve the usual narrative. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a hero. She was a woman with absolute power who used it, and that makes people uncomfortable. We remember tyrants like Caligula, dictators like Nero, but when a woman demands more than obedience, when she demands your heartbeat, accompany hers into death, we call it madness, or we pretend it never happened, but it did. And if you stand on that hill in northern England then, a windless night, when the air is thick and the stars seem far, you might hear the truth rising up through the moss. You might hear it breathe. Not her, not the queen, the others, the ones she took with her. The true horror was never in the soil or the screams. It was in the silence of the survivors. In the world that let her be buried as a queen. Have you ever heard of a darker fate than? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more true horror from forgotten history, don't forget to subscribe.